Is sex a drive? In other words, are we wired to want to have sex? Especially so that our human race can continue on. So we're driven to procreate. Now, Freud said yes. Freud said we have an innate drive for sex, and that we are constantly craving it subconsciously. But I don't believe he said that this is far more so, say, for males than for females. And secondly, even if our bodies are wired to get a huge bang, so to speak, especially in males, by engaging in sex, does that mean we should just indulge in it willy-nilly, as much as possible, and then minimize the downsides, whether the downsides might be illegitimate children, children we can't raise well, children we don't want in general, catching a disease, and the financial burdens incurred too. Some of which are obviated or pushed aside by those who pursue abortions, and I'm not mentioning anything morally about this, but simply the pursuit of it being done by some people. Or I would say aborting a child after it's born, the child born, by letting Child Protective Services swoop in and take the child away with a slap on the wrist to the parent, upon which, for all intents and purposes, you could say the parent had aborted a child up to the age of 18 in terms of, quote, getting rid of a child they didn't want by having Child Protective Services abort the child from their lives permanently. Now, if we're going to talk about sex, especially in males, as a very important, or rather very, very strong payoff in terms of pleasure. What about crack cocaine then? For it is said, I don't have like reams of scientific evidence, but it's said that crack cocaine, if you try it even one time, you're hooked. I would say probably because it has such a huge bang for the buck, just like sex. But of course, given that, does that mean one should indulge in the use of crack cocaine willy-nilly and then control the side effects? I'm not sure, for instance, with heroin, but Mick Jagger, I believe it was, of the Rolling Stones, once used heroin for many years. And he controlled the side effects to a certain extent by buying pharmaceutical-grade heroin. In other words, it was reliable as to the content and safety as opposed to cheaper grades having something adulterated substances put in or being cut. And then he would very carefully measure it out somehow so he got the exact dose every time that he wanted. Now, if somebody is addicted, so to speak, to alcohol, usually the question is, why are they overindulging in alcohol or using it at all? It's generally to numb the brain so that one doesn't feel pain from some thinking on a certain matter. In other words, one is escaping from one's thoughts by drinking. One's dulling the thought processes with lots of side effects, so to speak. Well, couldn't it be said then that engaging in any amount of sex, yes, is pleasurable, but so is alcohol use? But what about the distractive purpose of sexuality or the distractive purpose, again, of crack cocaine? Otherwise, why couldn't we say, well, a little crack cocaine is just enjoyable for the buzz you get? But can one have just a little sex? Or is it like crack cocaine? You want more and more and more. For we have seen certain presidents, certain golfers, certain everybody taste this crack cocaine called sexuality and want more and more and more of it and have the power to get it too. And so you have to wonder also why the pursuit of a male having roving eyes, so to speak, of having so many affairs so often. Females might have affairs also sometimes, but I think probably not in the same number or the same reasons often. The female having an affair probably is having it far more often because a husband at present is causing mayhem in the family from too much aggression or how he treats the children too, not just aggression towards the wife, and as to how much time he spends with the children and his empathy for them, whereas the male tends, I believe, to have affairs because the female is simply someone they have become too used to, thus bored by. The male wants variety, not just the pleasure of sex, which also gives him more bang for the buck, I do believe, usually than for the female. In my opinion, anyway, it's like a female trying crack cocaine, and it just doesn't have much effect on her. But crack cocaine, so to speak, in sexual form for the male, has a markedly bigger bang for the buck. But of course, getting back then to variety desires also, I believe this ties in even to the concept of boredom. So many people complain at their jobs, for instance, of boredom and wish to spend time on the internet here and there, checking the email also constantly, or looking at the cell phone, or playing YouTube videos at every second that they can. They cite because their jobs are so boring. Or, in other words, maybe there's not enough required in a job from moment to moment, or it's too routine. And I think many a male says, my wife is too routine. There's not enough variety from her to stimulate me to feel distracted from my painful thoughts. It could be argued, though, just as an aside here, that while the male may want sexuality for distraction, all the far more than a female, and variety too, perhaps that is why the male likes variety in terms of his job also. Maybe a female likes variety and distraction sometimes through raising children alternatively. Everything a child does sometimes new and interesting, and thus a form of distraction also. Hence, raising children can be a distractive mechanism, surely. Just like a male having affairs or distractions through his work. And once one has figured something out, one tends to be not as distracted anymore. Or if there's no data coming in at all, like those chambers that one can float on water in and feels nothing. People say sometimes that they go nuts in such a circumstance. There's not enough distraction coming in. This, even in my opinion, being why many people have a component in which they love to live in major urban areas for the chaos, for the noise included, for the constant titillation, for distraction as a key component. Maybe then there's something to even biblical scriptures saying, to words to the effect, be still and know that I'm God. I can't remember the phraseology exactly, but in other words, don't be so distracted and realize perhaps that you are not a god, which is somewhat troubling to some people. They would like to think they can pull a rabbit out of a hat, in essence being a god or goddess. And hence the phrase, too, perhaps, don't just do something, sit there. I forget who coined that and perhaps turned it into a book, but the idea being that one can discover things one might not even want to know by doing nothing, hence by not being distracted. I'll perhaps close on this topic for now by bringing up a couple interesting facts I once ran across. That some people from Mexico, say, especially smaller communities, come to America, legally or illegally, for a major reason being that they're too bored in their villages. You might say also with television now that they often may watch people in America and think because of our level of material distractiveness and other matters too, that the grass must be always greener on the other side. And that if someone has a Rolls Royce, so to speak, and they have a donkey, that the Rolls Royce owner must be happier. Of course, they don't know the Rolls Royce might be in the shop all the time and make you have to work a lot of hours. And you might not like that job and have to compromise morally also. But many in Mexico or other outlying areas in general, smaller communities in general, may look and think that this Rolls-Royce approach to life, the Rolex watch approach to life, has all upsides and no downsides. Hence come to America. And they may even burn their bridges, so to speak, economically or legally, and find it hard to return if they even wanted to, especially if they have children here. They might say thus, the small-town life in Mexico or the small-town life anywhere is too undistracting, and in the same manner, a male might say it's too undistracting, too boring not to have affairs, not to engage in lots of sex in general. But does that mean then we have a strong sex drive that we ought not regulate, internally at least? On the similar plane, does that mean all Mexicans in small towns, all people in small villages anywhere, have a drive built in to live in major metropolitan areas, even 20 million plus urban cities, mega jungles you might call them? Is that a drive then? Just like Freud said we have a sex drive, but is not talking about this far more so, he might say, in males than females. He didn't say, for instance, females have a drive to have children for distraction sometimes, or ego building. In other words, saying, look what I created out of thin air. Just like the male may say, look what I did, I have another conquest to put on as a notch on my belt. Ego-building thing for him. I'd say one last point. I was reading in a book a year or two ago about a man who started a mission, so to speak, in life of helping the quote-unquote homeless. He had lived in America and then went to Mexico for a period of time. I'm not sure how much time, and in a small village. And he believed he was so bored there, he said. The combination of small town living and only having basically, as he put it, rice and beans to eat. He so craved his steaks. And when he came back to America, he felt that was a major detractor of the more inexpensive way of life in Mexico in small villages. It was too boring. So perhaps then he wished distraction from the urban way of life in comparison and from food. He did not say anything about sexuality, but you can guess by extension that he had possibly an interest in sex also for distractive purposes, and maybe a roving eye too, as per variety. Now, of course, I'm not going to say an all or nothing thing for anything, but certainly I think the idea of sex as a drive per se that we just need to satisfy is a very curious one. You can't just say use of meth, use of crack cocaine especially, is a drive also, and thus we ought to just indulge in it willy-nilly. Isn't that, for instance, then why we wear clothing? Not just for protecting from the elements, say cold weather especially, or abrasion, from scratching ourselves too much on various surfaces, especially the feet perhaps. But something to consider here. Maybe we wear clothing also so as not to overstimulate ourselves sexually, and thus act in moderation. You might go the opposite direction, though, in some worlds in the Middle East, say some countries, and have certain people cover themselves from head to toe so that they're not distractive at all in public. I like to think all in moderation. You can die from drinking too much water. I suppose you can even have problems from hyperventilating. In other words, drinking too much air. So I wish I could tighten up these concepts a little bit better, but these are my ideas at present, just to consider. I think sexuality should be considered as built into us, yes, as something that evolved over time. But then, does that mean, once again, we have a built-in craving that ought to be indulged in for crack cocaine also? Many people may find indulgence in sexuality to a considerable degree to have no downsides only because everyone else is experiencing the same downsides. In terms of the amount of time put in to raise children, or the cost involved also. One person, for instance, with a PhD in the psyche field once telling me 20 years ago that in his belief it takes $180,000 to raise a child to age 18. But then one of his children became a lawyer, and that, of course, is costly. Maybe his children were also raised wearing diapers that were made out of 24-karat gold, I'm not sure, whereas others wear diapers made out of cloth. I'm just speaking a little humorously here, but there can be an analogy, for instance. Maybe his children were to be raised not to be plumbers or electricians or anything else, including a philosopher living in his car for 5 or more years, much of the time, like Sam in the video channel Inspirational Nomad. A profound philosopher in my belief, and yet torn down by someone for quote-unquote living in his car some of the time. So crack cocaine can be said to be very injurious as to its downsides by, I don't know, the effects on the brain, the effects on the brain cells. Maybe it kills off some brain cells. And of course, some people might indulge in what they call crime to pay for the drug itself. Others might have a discontentedness to see people strung out in general on certain drugs. Yet the question is, in my mind, what could be accomplished in a person's life and in society in general and for the human race if we spent less time indulging even moderately, some say, in sexuality and having children as a result too to raise? It's said, well, there's no downsides to raising children, but is there really no downside? What problems could we have solved if we weren't raising children? Could we have solved cancer? Could we have solved world hunger? Could we have gotten ourselves to another planet already? Could we have come up with profound psychological and philosophical and religious insights, bar none, 10 times over, 100 times over, if most of us weren't raising children and being married and engaging in even moderate degrees thus of sexuality, even if the children are brought up well, it is said. For we have way too many children and people on the planet already to be saying, well, everybody must raise children or else we'd go extinct. I'd close with one final analogy then. Some might take a little or more offense, but I think it's an interesting point. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche once said, "A married philosopher is a joke." Well, he might also have said this because he could have said, a person with children is also a joke if they consider themselves a philosopher. Or a person engaging in sexuality, basically, more than once a month or something, is also not going to be much of a philosopher. He could even have said, if you have a full-time job, you're not going to be much of a philosopher, in part for its distractive purposes or to pay for the spouse or the child or the home, etc., etc. And of course then we're talking about the degree of capacity to be a great philosopher. Nietzsche, arguably, yes, not perfect at all in his philosophy, did promote many, many great ideas, at least as food for thought, or you might say in writing circles as grist for the mill for society's purposes, not just the author alone. And so, if there were not this engagement in sexuality, even in a moderate proportion, and the raising of children in many a way, shape, and form, and marriage, might we have had 10,000 or 1,000,000 Nietzsches instead of one Nietzsche or 5? Might we have had also 10,000 Einsteins instead of one Einstein, this time, of course, in the field of physics? Might we have had 10,000 Gandhis and 10,000 great politicians also, if one touts the advantages of a Mr. Reagan, or the advantages of a Gorbachev, or the advantages of a Boris Yeltsin to tear down the wall in the latter two cases? Might we have had 10,000 or even 1,000,000 Gorbachevs and Boris Yeltsins if we weren't engaged in what we call acceptable ways of distraction in a way, shape, and form that didn't enable us to become at the level of a Nietzsche, so to speak, in philosophy, where he said a married philosopher is a joke, in terms of the quantity of output and quality of output, even though not perfect. Of course, then, for those who are Christians, I would say this, would Jesus have been Jesus if he had been married and had children? Would he have been able to come up with the ideas and the mission in life and the acting on it if he had as a mission of prime importance to raise children and a family life that was quite distractive in general, and a home also to look after and improve upon every weekend by going to a local box store for improvements? Note that they call it home improvement stores, or I say perhaps the distraction store tied to your home. Yes, so before we say even that a moderate degree of sexuality, such that, and quote, responsible raising of children such that they are not abandoned, is acceptable to society, what are the downsides if we could have had 10,000 Einsteins, 10,000 Gorbachevs, 10,000, some would say even Mr. Reagans, instead of one Mr. Reagan? What if we could have had 10,000 Abe Lincolns if there were fewer instances of marriage, raising acceptably of children, full-time careers, and so on and so on and so on. There are downsides then that apparently aren't so apparent. We go and we say, oh, well, those were just geniuses. They were flukes. They were frogs born with 6 legs. They were freaks of nature. But maybe their biggest component was often not the use of what is called ordinariness in terms of engagement in sexuality and even work. And by work, I mean something of the type that is mainly just manufacturing widgets on an assembly line, not work in terms of something, quote, creative, something out of the box, and something useful in society that's called a better mousetrap. In other words, those in the tech field would say the iPhone and the iPad weren't just cute little devices or toys. They were a quantum leap forward in the business field and learning field. Maybe we need a lot more of these in every area of life. And again, those in the religious sphere saying if they so love what Jesus did for the world and for them, or those in other areas too, for instance, the Buddha, for those who are of a different persuasion, maybe we could have had 10,000 or 1,000,000 Buddhas by now, and 10,000 Jesuses too, if more people were raised under certain circumstances similar. I would close by saying I believe the Buddha was once married, and then he left the marriage. Gandhi was also once married. He left the marriage. And Jesus never was married. Gandhi also gave up all sex after a certain point, perhaps around age 35. And I don't know the sexual component in the Buddha's life, but I don't think he was engaging in it too much, if any. These are just some speculative thoughts here, and of course, no sexuality would mean no children and the end of the human race. Similarly, no work on the assembly line, and we would have no cars, no nothing. We need, of course, a balance, but I don't think we need 10,000 different varieties of fingernail polish in our lives, or the varieties thereof, what we call all too often Amazon purchases in my mind, or whatever box store is involved in its case, and quicker than Jiminy Cricket too as to delivery and great return policies also. What could we thus have accomplished if we weren't engaging in distractions, in our favorite crack cocaines of choice that we claim have minimal downside? Do they really have that much minimal downside if they're simply not eating away their brain cells? What is the downside as per what we could have accomplished by now? We progress seemingly so slowly over the millennia. Could we be in other solar systems by now? Could we be, oh my goodness, so many light years from here by now? Could we have conquered all disease, all hatred, all war, and by now, completely, all pandemics, everything, if only we weren't engaging in what we call, or I call, possibly, the varieties in which we are not becoming a profound figure in mankind. Whatever way, shape, or form you define this person to be, again, in your view, a Abe Lincoln, a Reagan, a Buddha, Jesus, Gandhi, what have you. You can go down and down the line. Mother Teresa, for those who are of certain persuasions. One last thought. Catholic priests do not marry and are not supposed to have sex also with anybody, but do find it very tempting it has been said on occasion to engage in certain dalliances with boys. Temptation thus being there to engage in sexuality for distractive purposes, I shall say. If they can't get it, quote unquote, in one way, maybe another way. And it is said, too, of the Mennonite faith that there is much abuse, sexuality, sexual abuse also with regard to their children. The Mennonites aren't about to divorce or stray outside of the family for sexual reasons. Perhaps they engage then in distractions, including for variety purposes with children, above what is what would like to be publicly acknowledged. This information, by the way, coming from the mouth of some Mennonites themselves. I'm not cooking this up. Isn't that then, thus, the gist of it then, as to sexual child abuse, as it's called, if we're going to call it abuse? If a man doesn't want to divorce and move on, if you wanted to call it that, if he doesn't want to have affairs, if he doesn't want to have children, or rather sex, and then have the spouse have an abortion repeatedly, maybe his form, thus in his own mind, is to have engagement, so to speak, with children, possibly, usually his own, but sometimes called sexual predators, as involved in other people also, other people's children. Maybe he does not want to, quote, go get a tranquilizer called medication to control things. Noting, by the way, that Alan Turing in England in the 1950s, I believe it was, there being a movie on this, by the way, having saved arguably 14 million lives in World War II by cracking the Enigma code that the Germans were using, the Nazis. Nevertheless, as a homosexual, it was deemed by the government at that time that this had to be controlled, and he was chemically castrated, and later he committed suicide as a result of this. The drugs affecting on him terribly. I wish again I could put all this together in one little neat box, one sentence long, just like the physicist wants to come up with the God equation, or it being said that you need to be able to state, as Einstein wanted to, all your thoughts in one sentence that a 5-year-old child could understand. Well, I don't think it would ever be that easy in many a way, shape, and form, and if I waited to polish my ideas up on these topics anymore, I'd probably be moving on, or have been hit by a bus by now, or get cancer and die, or whatnot. So I just present these thoughts as is, at my level of clarity now, at age 62, as opposed, say, to 42 or 22, when I didn't know anything whatsoever, comparatively, I think, to now. At least, that's my opinion. So, thoughts here as they are, and let them, I suppose, lie where they may. I hope not too many people offended terribly, but I suppose some of this would ring true in most people's lives. And I try to convey things with as much respect as possible. On the topics of sexuality, marriage, careers, and whatnot.